Switching to Mint Mobile is the easiest way to save in 2024. Wireless plans are $15 a month when you purchase a 3-month plan. To get this new customer offer, go to mintmobile.com/Murrell. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this edition of The News with Dan. We're going to lead off today with a lot of big Disney announcements that were made on their investor call yesterday. We're also going to take your calls on the Mint Mobile hotline. We're going to talk about a Hollywood legend that passed away a few days ago, and we're going to talk about what people are watching at home and, more importantly, how much they're spending to watch stuff at home. But let's jump into those big Disney announcements that happened yesterday. It was on the latest investor call where Disney revealed that their profits were up in the last fiscal quarter, even though a lot of their revenue was flat, and we'll look at that in a minute. But the big thing was the announcement of several new projects, some surprising projects that Bob Iger had in store. The biggest one of which, and the one that surprised me the most, is Moana 2, a sequel to Moana that nobody anticipated hitting theaters. Will be hitting theaters not next year, but this year in November. It's currently slated up against the opening date of Wicked Part 1. We'll see if Wicked moves. But this isn't a secret Moana project necessarily. This is being converted from a Disney Plus original series into a movie. Iger said that they've been working on this Moana series, which had previously been announced, and they liked what they saw so much that they said, you know what? We should make this into a movie and put it into theaters, which is a wonderful story that I don't buy for a second. I think that Disney needs a win at the box office. And if you watch one of my other shows, Streaming Charts with Dan, you'll know that Moana isn't just a popular film. It was, according to Disney, the most popular film streaming of all movies in 2023. Now, the information that I had was just the top 10 data that showed up on Nielsen's charts, which had Elemental just edging out Moana, and that's the chart you're looking at right now. But Disney probably has access to all of those hours, and it's very likely that Moana was just outside the top 10 a lot of weeks and was incurring additional hours. I can only go with the data that I have access to. So Disney is basically taking their most popular streaming film. Remember last year, they announced that there was going to be a Moana live action remake, which is still on the calendar for 2025. Currently, there are 2 different Moana films that are scheduled to be released within a year of each other. I don't know if that's going to happen, but obviously Disney saw an opportunity here to take advantage of the popularity of Moana. And so they're taking that streaming show and they're putting it into movies as a theatrical feature. I'm sure that the crew of that movie now is excited to hear about this and probably scrambling like crazy. The film's going to be directed by Dave Derrick Jr., who's a veteran Disney story consultant and animator, but this will be his first film. Lin-Manuel Miranda will not return to write the songs. They're going to be by Abigail Barlow and Emily Bear, who won a Grammy for their unofficial Bridgerton musical. Lin-Manuel Miranda's collaborator on some of the music in the first film, Opetaya Fwai, is returning, as is original composer Mark Mancina. One thing that we don't know yet is the cast of the movie. There's been no official confirmation that I could find that the original voice cast, including, of course, Dwayne Johnson as Maui, will be returning for this sequel movie. I would imagine if they don't get those actors back, that would be a pretty big hit for this film to not have that original cast back. So I imagine that they'll probably back up the Brinks truck to try to make that happen. But yeah, just looking at it on its own, to me, this was a pretty obvious play for Disney to say, hey, you don't think that we have any big movies coming up or any big hits coming up? Well, we've got Moana 2, and it's coming this year. Some people may praise its boldness. I think that it's a pretty obvious desperation move. If I'm going to be honest, I think it's a desperation move from Disney. That doesn't mean I think the movie's going to be bad. I think it's interesting at this point to turn a series into a theatrical film on this short of a timeline. I'm going to be interested to see how they're able to do that and how that movie flows when it actually comes out. But I don't think that Disney would do this if we were in the same world that we were in even a year ago. Moana is a huge asset to them, and if they were still as focused on Disney Plus as they have been in the past several years, they would never take an original Moana series off that streaming service. This just underscores what we've been seeing, which is that so many studios, I think, underestimated the value of the theatrical distribution model to their business. And now that streaming has been slower to turn profits for all these different companies, they're now looking for ways to infuse the studios with cash. Keep in mind also that Bob Iger is in the middle of a huge fight with two different groups of activist investors who are trying to take people off of the Disney board that are currently on the board and are trying to put their own people on the board in order to change the direction of the company because they think that the stock isn't performing as high as it should be. Disney even went so far as to put out a website this week that tells shareholders how to vote for which board members they want to put on the board ahead of the annual investors meeting in April, using like Disney animated characters, but it's slightly dystopian.
Remember, it's important you vote only for Disney's 12 nominees using the white proxy card. Do not vote for the Trian Group or Blackwell's nominees.
And it just shows you the lengths to which they're going to go to ensure the continuity of the board of directors and to make sure that no activist investors get in there and try to muck things up. And honestly, I think that this Moana 2 news and all the other stuff that we're going to talk about should be seen in this context. There is a ticking clock until early April, and the voting begins soon as far as who is going to be on the board of directors. And it's very obvious to me that Bob Iger and the rest of the Disney board said, all right, we need to go into this investor call as this whole process is starting to ramp up with a big show of strength that says that we know what we're doing with this company, we're taking some bold directions, and we're going to succeed. Moana 2 is one of those things. Another big announcement was that Disney Plus will become the exclusive home for Taylor Swift, The Eras Tour. The movie that had a great box office run will debut on Disney Plus on March 15th, featuring 5 songs that weren't in either the theatrical version or the extended version that was available for people to watch at home. And I think this is going to be massive for Disney Plus because it's not just the presence of the Eras Tour movie, it's getting that additional material, which means that all of the Swifties that went to see the movie in theaters are more than likely going to tune in again on Disney Plus if they weren't already to see these additional songs and this additional material. This is a huge get for Disney. What we don't know is how much they paid to secure the exclusive digital rights to the Eras Tour. My guess is it's a lot, but again, a show of strength and an immediate show of strength from Bob Iger and the board to any perhaps skeptical investors that are saying we're going to be aggressive about succeeding today, right now. Another big announcement was that Disney is investing $1.5 billion in Epic Games, the owners of Fortnite, to expand Disney IP into gaming, especially Fortnite, with a complete interconnected Disney universe. Now, there's no timetable on this, but gaming is something that Bob Iger said that he was very anxious to get Disney involved in. And again, strategically, it's another example of him saying, no, look, see, under my leadership, we're now going into this hugely popular, very young skewing video game universe and setting up our own world with the IP. They said it's going to be Disney, Star Wars, Marvel, Pixar, all the stuff that Disney owns inside of this video game world. And it's another sign from Disney saying, we're not planning 5 years down the road. We want to get people excited and buzzing right now. And honestly, when you look at just those 3 things, Moana 2, the Eras Tour, Fortnite, this to me is a page out of what has always been Bob Iger's playbook, going back to the acquisitions of Pixar and Marvel and all of the other properties, Star Wars, of course, where you're going to succeed by just acquiring things, acquiring brands. This is what Bob Iger does. This is what led to so much of his success the first time that he was at the head of Disney. And the one thing that they have yet to do that they also did under Bob Iger's leadership was to come up with an original property that's hugely successful, like a Moana, like a Frozen. And so, yes, I think that this is impressive and they're spending big. They're doing big acquisitions and big splashy things to get people excited. But I also think the one thing that Disney has to crack, and pretty soon, is that next new original idea. But because of this success now strategy, most of what Disney has on deck are sequels: Toy Story, Zootopia, Moana, Inside Out, things that people already love. Will it pay off? That's the question. But I think in the short term, Bob Iger is looking to allay any fears among the shareholders that he might be at the head of a sinking ship. Some other announcements made yesterday were the renewal of Percy Jackson and the Olympians for season 2. That's no surprise. The streaming numbers that have come in have been very strong. It seemed to be well regarded by both fans and critics. Also, the announcement or the confirmation of the ESPN standalone streaming service, which is coming in fall of next year, 2025. It will include multiple ESPN networks along with other content. Keep in mind, this is separate from a combined sports streaming venture that was already announced a few days ago from Warner Brothers Discovery, Disney, and Fox, the portions of Fox that Disney didn't buy, the non-studio portions, which will be a pool of some combination of all of their sporting resources as a standalone service. And it is so funny how we see old ideas that are recycled, because when you think about it, the idea of all of these different media companies coming together and joining forces on a streaming service to combine all of their assets, that's what Hulu was. That's exactly what Hulu was. And then everybody sold off their different shares, and now Disney is the owner of Hulu. And yet we're now going back to this whole collective thing. There are so many things like the theatrical model and this combining resources for streaming that have already been done, that were partially abandoned, and we're now coming back to. Disney also announced that they will be launching a password sharing crackdown similar to the one that Netflix did, which led to an increase in subscribers for Netflix. And when you look at the overall financials of Disney yesterday across all divisions, the story really was that revenue was flat or down in a lot of those divisions, I'd say most of them, but profit was up. And that's because Disney had all of those cost-cutting measures, writing down stuff that was on streaming, the layoffs that they did over the past year or so, all of the stuff that so many of those activist investors wanted the company to do, they did. That cut costs. They also cut down on what they were making, their investment in different programming. The streaming losses have been narrowing for Disney over the past several quarters. They're down to about $150 million over the last quarter versus close to $1 billion the same quarter this time last year. So it's not so much that the company is making more money, but they were able to cut down on costs, which drove profit up, which means that the stockholders are going to get an increased dividend, which if you hold Disney stock is something that may make you say, hey, you know what? Current leadership is not too bad. That's the way that most companies are run now. It's not necessarily what's best for the business, it's what's best for the stockholders. Disney Plus actually lost about 1 million subscribers, especially after they raised the cost of the service. But as I mentioned, the streaming losses have really narrowed down to about $150 million, and Disney Plus will start turning a profit barring some kind of a disaster later this year, perhaps as early as the fall of this year. That's been a much anticipated thing, the day that Disney Plus actually generates money instead of generating massive deficits. The company had lower performance on the content sales and licensing front, largely due to the fact that they had Wish and the Marvels, a fairly weak slate of theatrical films that they couldn't sell for as much money. ESPN revenue was flat. Parks revenue was up a little bit, but apparently the North American parks were not part of that increase. Disneyland revenue was reportedly flat. Walt Disney World revenue was reportedly down a bit. So those increases are due to the international tourism and parks that Disney offers. And then linear TV and programming was of course down because fewer people are watching TV. There's not as much advertising money, etc. Of course, Disney wants to cut down on those linear costs with the ESPN standalone streaming service and stuff like that to boost the lost revenue from people that are cutting the cord. And what I see when I look at all of this, the new announcements and the Eras Tour, Fortnite, etc., is Bob Iger armoring up for war. And he's putting on the best armor that he knows how to wear, and that has always been IP. Intellectual property. It's how he built Disney into the biggest studio in the world the first time he was the CEO, and it's how he's looking to rebuild that invincible Disney of years past by leveraging the hottest properties that he can purchase, license, or manufacture. This strategy worked before the first time he was CEO with strong new Disney original content, as well as Pixar and Star Wars and Marvel, and it looks like he's trying to replicate that by resuscitating those brands, by cutting down the number of things that they make, by returning to the theatrical model in some way, shape, or form, and by acquiring new things that will bring especially younger people to the platform. Will he be able to replicate that success? Those activist investors that are seeking board seats would tell you no. Bob Iger is doing his best to convince everybody else that the answer is yes. So that's what's going on in the wonderful world of Disney. Let's now take your calls on the Mint Mobile hotline, which I love doing both on this show and also on Charts with Dan. And our first question this week is from Alex, who has a question about one of Disney's franchises, the Indiana Jones films.
Hey, Dan. This is Alex from Memphis, Tennessee. I'm a big fan of the Indiana Jones franchise, but for me particularly, I have a bit of a hot take. I love Raiders of the Lost Ark, of course, but my favorite has always been Temple of Doom, and I understand that it's objectively not as strong a film as Raiders, but I think it's a fun adventure that is a solid sequel. My hot take, even more so than that, I guess, is that Last Crusade is the point in the series where things go downhill. I think that it was that movie that started the trend of every single one being the same Nazi formula. I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that. I'm sure you disagree, but yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks for that question, Alex. And this is something that I've heard a lot of Indiana Jones fans talk about. Not many people think that Temple of Doom is the best Indiana Jones film, but the ones that do generally really tend to prefer it for the reasons that you're talking about, because it feels so different from the first movie and the third movie. And I also see your point about the third movie being where it goes back to sort of replicating what Raiders of the Lost Ark did instead of doing something radically different in the manner that Temple of Doom did. You're making strong points. And the one thing that I want to address most of all is when you said that Raiders of the Lost Ark was objectively a better film. And this is something that I talk about here on the channel all the time. No, it's not. And the reason I say that it's not is because you think that Temple of Doom is better. And art, movies, painting, TV shows, whatever, art is subjective. There is no objectively better or objectively worse because it is down to each person's preferences and interpretation of that art. And you laid out very clearly, and I think in a very cogent way, why you prefer Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. There is no right or wrong. And I think about this a lot because obviously where most people saw me first on the internet was Movie Fights, which was a really, really fun show to do. We had such a great time doing that show for all the years that we did it, and I miss doing the show a lot. My one hesitation with the show is I think sometimes we weren't clear enough about what the show's intent was. The intent really was to lean into the ridiculousness of trying to make objective arguments about subjective things, because they are ultimately pointless arguments. You know, it doesn't really matter, you know, who's the best Hollywood Jack or whatever it is. But because we on the show, and myself in particular, took the movie Fight itself so seriously and were so passionate about what we did, I think that it did encourage people to go out there and try to find the objective answers to those questions, because we were up there and we had a judge who was deciding who's right and who's wrong about certain things. But our intent was never to encourage an atmosphere where you have to fight and argue until you find the right answer. That was a show that we always took in a spirit of fun, even if it looked intense while we were doing it. After the camera shut off, we all laughed about it just because it was such a fun show to do. And so that's sort of like my post-Movie Fights quest, is to spread that word, which is that the most important opinion about any movie or TV show is your own. And Alex, you don't have to justify to anybody or qualify why you think Temple of Doom is the best Indiana Jones movie, because you have your own reasons for liking it. And that's all that matters. The only time I would ever push back against anyone's opinion on a movie is if they said, well, I don't like that movie. I don't have to see it to know that I don't like it. That I disagree with, because I do think that you have to see something to know whether it's good or bad. But I don't think that you have to justify your own opinions. Everything is subjective. And Alex, if you think Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom is the best Indiana Jones movie, that's perfectly okay. Don't let anybody tell you you're wrong, and enjoy the hell out of it. Our next call is from Dave, who is invoking one of my favorite movie performances of all time and also a series of egregious Oscar oversights.
Hey, Dan, this is Dave from the Philly area. My question is, I'm a huge horror fan, and with all this talk of award seasons, horror movies always get snubbed. I remember very famously you were a very vocal, supporter of the Oscar for Tony thing when Toni Collette was snubbed for Hereditary. Just curious what your thoughts are on why horror never gets the recognition it deserves.
Thanks for that question, Dave. I will never turn down a chance to talk about Toni Collette and Hereditary. It is criminal that she wasn't nominated, and it's criminal that she was never even in contention or in consideration to be nominated. I felt the same way about Lupita Nyong'o and Us. I think that she was equally as deserving of an Academy Award nomination, and I think that they were both disqualified because they were the leads in horror films. And with a handful of notable exceptions, The Exorcist, maybe Silence of the Lambs, and a few others, horror films are usually completely discounted when it comes to the Academy Awards. And to answer the question of why that is, honestly, I think that it is, first of all, genre bias. I think that there are a lot of people out there that just say, I don't watch horror movies. They think that they're all schlocky, that they have no redeeming value. For a lot of people, they think that they're harmful to society. And so I think that they just write off horror films without even seeing them. Sight unseen, they won't even watch them. I also think that because they often involve blood and gore, a lot of times dark humor, they're seen as frivolous, or they're seen as unimportant, or not suggestive to the film discourse in some way. And I think that really it's the same bias that a lot of comedies face. It's the same bias that a lot of science fiction and fantasy films face. Again, I think with less frequency than with horror films, but it's the idea that the only movies that really have power and impact are hard-hitting dramas that feature great dramatic performances. And I think that that's just not true. There is absolutely a bias against horror films, and it's one of the last biases that I think that the Academy has done nothing to work against. I don't see a whole lot of progress in horror films and performances in horror films being taken seriously, and I hope that that changes in the next several years, because horror movies are just as difficult to make as a lot of other movies. Yes, there are a lot of terrible horror films, but there are a lot of terrible films of all genres. And maybe, at least my hope is, that this generation that is newer to the Academy, as they begin to lead the film discourse and they become more senior members of the Academy and other awards voting bodies, that they will understand that horror films are just as impactful as dramas and comedies and sci-fi and everything else, and that the performances in those films are just as worthy of praise, admiration, and award consideration. Finally, we have a mystery caller who wants to know about how I do some of the videos on this channel.
Hi, Dan. Big fan of the show. Just had a question about how your process for doing reviews. I write my own reviews of movies just for fun that I put up on Facebook, and I thought about maybe doing a YouTube channel, but it takes me a while to compose my thoughts. And I watch you and other reviewers seem to, just be able to sort of spout them off, and I'm wondering what the process is like. Are you writing things down, reading off the teleprompter? Are you able to sort of speak as eloquently as you do, sort of off the cuff? Any advice you could give about how to proceed? All of that would be helpful. So thank you very much.
Thanks for calling in. And a lot of people have asked my advice on criticism and how to get started as a critic. And I mean, really the advice, and this isn't a cop-out, is that there's no real right or wrong way to do it. My personal process is different from a lot of other people's, but that doesn't make mine better or worse. For example, a lot of people take notes during movies. A lot of critics that I know, some great critics, take notes. Roger Ebert took notes during movies. I don't do that because I find that it breaks my immersion. If I'm worried about what I'm writing down, or if it's, legible, or if I'm on the right line, then I feel like I'm not engaging with the film 100% as I should be. So I generally don't keep notes during a movie. As the credits roll or as I'm walking out of the theater, a lot of times I'll sit on my phone and I'll type out my immediate thoughts so I don't forget anything. But that's not a thing that's right or wrong. That's just my personal preference. If you want to start reviewing movies and taking notes is what works for you, then I think that you should do that. As far as my process here on the air, I don't have a teleprompter. Both because it's just not something that I think I could install. This is a very kind of low-tech setup, but also because, I'd have to run it, and I think that it would be more distracting than it is helpful. But I also don't just speak off the cuff, and that's what a lot of people think. Oh, you're just kind of speaking off the cuff. If I showed you my raw footage from all the stuff I do here on the channel, your estimation of me would drop considerably. It would be pretty disastrous. I stop and start. I forget what I was going to say. I muddle up words. Sometimes those mistakes even make it to the air. It takes me probably 30 to 50% longer to film a video than the final product that you see. This is not just straight to camera, one take. And I think that's the case with most people on YouTube. It might look to some people effortless, but there is a lot of effort that goes into it. When I'm doing a review, I'll write out my quick notes as soon as I see it. If I have time, and I like when I have that time, I'll kind of marinate on a movie for a few hours before I start writing my review out. Then I will sort of start writing out notes, take down the pieces of information that I want. If there's some research that I want to do, I'll do that. And I basically write out a rough script, a rough outline that's not on a teleprompter, but it's just right here. You can't see, but right here off screen, I've got my computer, which has all of my notes, and I basically take it in chunks. I look at what I want to say, I kind of divide the review into little bits, and I say what I want. If I flub what I said, then I'll repeat, I'll go over, I'll say it again until I get it right. And then in the editing process, I'll combine a couple different takes together, or I'll use one take over the other until you get the final review that you see at home. So that's my process, but everybody has a different one. I think the most important thing if you're starting out in criticism is to make sure that you're embracing your own voice, what you bring to the table. Don't parrot what other people say, because that's their voice and that already exists in the world. Find your voice and then find the best way to express that voice. Is it direct to camera like I'm doing now? Is it voiceover? Is it in a podcast, a more discussion format? It doesn't matter. The important thing is that you're doing it the way that feels right to you. So that would be my advice. Experiment with it a little bit. Decide if taking notes is right or not right for you. And then experiment with how you want to express yourself and find the way that you're most comfortable with. Thanks to everybody that called in on the Mint Mobile hotline, and I would love to hear your question. If you want to get your question answered here on the show, call in at +1 323 863 3311. I take questions on this show as well as Charts with Dan and Streaming Charts with Dan when I do that show. So really you can ask about just about anything. And of course, I want to thank the people that make the Mint Mobile hotline possible, Mint Mobile. It's getting close to Valentine's Day, which is when we celebrate the ones we love. But whether you're single, happily paired, or in a throuple plus, no judgment here, there's one thing we all love, and that's saving money. Well, like a creepy naked Cupid, Mint Mobile is spreading the love because right now, all wireless plans are just $15 a month when you purchase a 3-month plan. That's unlimited talk, text, and data for $15 a month. How's that for a Valentine? If you choose Mint Mobile, you're making the decision to put money back in your pocket every month. Whatever you're paying for wireless service now, think about what you'd save if that bill was just $15 a month. At Mint, all plans come with unlimited talk and text plus high-speed data delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. And you don't have to change your number. You can use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and bring your phone number along with all your existing contacts. So dump that overpriced contract today and say yes to Mint Mobile. To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/Murrell. That's mintmobile.com/Murrell. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/Murrell. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. All right, before we go, I want to wrap up with a couple of quick news stories. The first is a report about how much we as consumers are spending watching movies and other entertainment at home. This is a report from the Digital Entertainment Group, and it covered all consumer home spending for the year 2023. This is a preliminary version of a much more detailed report that's going to come out next month. And the general bullet points are that overall spending on home viewing increased 17% in 2023 to $43 billion. That was led heavily by subscription streaming. Subscription streaming spending increased 21% in 2023 over the previous year to $37 billion. Digital purchase spending was up 13% year over year. So those are rentals and purchases through Amazon or iTunes, etc. The only thing that was down, not surprisingly, were disc sales and rentals, which were down 25% year over year. As a matter of fact, DEG will no longer track disc rentals after Netflix discontinued their mail service. And looking at some of the top performing movies of the year, some of them are expected, but there are some surprise titles in there. Select top performers include Avatar: The Way of Water, Dungeons & Dragons, Honor Among Thieves, The Flash, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, John Wick Chapter 4, Meg 2: The Trench, Plane. I was surprised to see that one there. Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, the Super Mario Bros. Movie, and Transformers: Rise of the Beast. So there are some box office hits on that list, but also a lot of box office flops and a few movies that did well in theaters, but obviously had their grosses bolstered by home rental, purchasing, streaming, etc. And this is why I always say, and I say it on Charts with Dan, that the box office isn't everything. The box office can definitely make a movie, but it doesn't necessarily break a movie, unless it's a case like The Flash, which lost, I think, $200 million at the box office. That's tough to overcome. But the story doesn't end with the box office. That's why I also do streaming charts with Dan. And this is just one example of how a movie like Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves can have perhaps a disappointing box office run, but then become popular and a draw on streaming and home entertainment. That's what I enjoy doing. That's what I enjoy tracking. And actually, DEG has a lot of charts that I didn't know they put out that track home entertainment that I'm looking at incorporating into streaming charts with Dan in the future. Finally, I wanted to take a couple of minutes on the show to pay tribute to a Hollywood legend, certainly a Hollywood legend to the last couple of generations, who passed away a few days ago, and that is Carl Weathers, who had a multi-generational impact across different genres of movie and television. His breakout role was alongside Sylvester Stallone as Apollo Creed in Rocky. He was also big on the action scene in the 1980s in movies like Predator and Action Jackson. And then for kind of my generation, he reinvented himself in a lot of comedic roles, such as Happy Gilmore, and as himself in Arrested Development. I say to myself at least 2 or 3 times a week, oh, we got a stew going. I love him in that show. He also had a late career surge in the past few years, playing Greef Karga in The Mandalorian, and also focused a lot of his later years being a television director, including multiple episodes of The Mandalorian. Carl Weathers is one of those actors that I always love to see pop up in a big role or in a small role. He had natural charisma, and you can't teach that. I think that's just something that you're born with. He had that instant likability, that believability, and you just invested in him and invested in his character. Apollo Creed is somebody who you don't like in Rocky, but you don't hate him. He's an antagonist, but I wouldn't necessarily say he's a villain. And I think that Carl Weathers knew how to play that part and knew how to play it in a way that the progression of that relationship between him and Rocky throughout the 4 movies that he appeared in was natural. It made sense. By the end, you loved Apollo Creed, and I would say that Carl Weathers' likability as Apollo Creed is what has allowed that franchise to live on through the Creed films. I think if you didn't like Apollo Creed, then you might not buy into the idea of liking his son, but because that was such a memorable character and he was such a memorable actor, it has extended the life of the franchise and spun it into a whole new generation with a whole new generation of actors and filmmakers. It was one of those things where, he just passed away apparently one night at home. It's not something that anybody saw coming, but it was news that I was definitely sad to hear. Carl Weathers leaves behind a great legacy across so many decades, and as always, my thoughts are with his family, friends, and fans.
Maybe we could win it back together. Eye of the tiger, man.
And that wraps it up for this edition of The News with Dan. Stay tuned right here. I've got movie reviews coming out later this week. I've also got a special video about what would happen if I ran the Academy Awards that I've been working on for a little bit, and I'm excited to bring you my ideas. And of course, any breaking news or stuff that might happen, you can catch it right here on the channel. Thanks again to everybody who decided to spend part of your day here with me. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.